In my last 20 years in and out of the media, sometimes being a full-time mother, going back to law a little bit, but mainly in terms of communication, there are some interviews that really excite me. Today's one is one such, The New Zealand Project by Max Harris. I want to just begin by quoting, as an introduction, to the ending of the book. Today, perhaps projecting a little based on my own experience, I think a different kind of heart needs repairing, the heart of our country. This repair is about all of us. We've stumbled and fallen. Our heart's connective tissue has been weakened, and we need the pulse of our social conscience to start beating harder again. So what are we waiting for, he asks. Max Harris, welcome.
Thank you.
That ending is so beautiful, and many of us are feeling we've lost our way in New Zealand. Take me back to the genesis of this book, how it all began, because there's a heart connection there. August 2014.
That's right. Yeah, so 3 years ago, my personal heart had a bit of a scare when I started having quite severe chest pains in New York, where I was working for Helen Clark in the United Nations. And I fainted then on the weekend in my apartment and decided I probably need to get this checked up on.
And you were what age?
I was 26.
26 to have this aortic problem.
Yeah, so I found out in the few hours ahead of me that it was something wrong with my aorta. That was probably a word I hadn't come across at that age. And I was told that I had an aortic aneurysm, which is where the blood vessel that carries blood and oxygen to the rest of your body gets so big that it's at risk of tearing.
Of bursting, actually.
Bursting,
burst.
yeah. And with fatal consequences. And so that was obviously quite shocking for me, and spent a bit of time trying to process that, and was told that I probably had a genetic condition, the life expectancy of which was 26.1 years, and I just turned 26, like I said. I also was told I had to have open heart surgery, which itself would have a mortality risk, and that the soonest I could get that surgery was about 3 to 4 months away, back in the UK. So went back to the UK, and this is relevant to the book, and then something else positive and unexpected too happened, which is that I heard about this exam in Oxford called the All Souls Prize Fellowship exam. And it's a very strange exam. It's a 12-hour exam and 6 hours of general questions and 6 hours of specialist questions. Pretty strange questions like, did Eve make the right choice, as in Adam and Eve? And then
I have to know, did you say yes or no?
I'm kind of cheating because I didn't answer that question, but that was one that I thought was too hard. I got a choice.
There was a powerful one based on Epicurus, wasn't there?
Yes,
which
exactly.
was relevant to what you just found. Could you tell us that?
So yeah, the phrase was Epicurus was from Epicurus, and it said something like, death is never really near us, because when we're dead, we're not there, and when we're here, death is not with us. Discuss. So it was about discussing death, and I'd been thinking a little bit about death. And the reason I sat this exam is partly I thought the questions would be interesting, and I guess I'm a bit of a geek, but also partly the people that pass the exam get 7 years of funding to do any kind of writing, and I'd always loved writing, and I thought this would be worth a shot to take my mind off the heart surgery that I had to have. So I took the exam. It ended up being a bit more interesting and less terrible than I thought. I was told I got called back for an interview, that I could do an interview, and that was pretty weird as well. It was like 50 or 60 Oxford academics in front of you in gowns asking you about every aspect of your exam. And thought the interview went really badly, but then they told me that I'd passed the interview and that I had 7 years of funding to do any kind of research or writing, and that was 1 week before the surgery.
It's such a dramatic opening to the book, because you have this terrible news and then this 7 years of fully funded study.
Yeah.
The worst and the best within a few months.
In some ways, exactly.
So what did you come up with, Max, as your option for this study?
So I guess I asked myself, what's the best use I can make of this amazing privilege, having come close to death?
There was a deeper question you asked yourself, wasn't it? It was about, what's my purpose here? What am I here to achieve?
What kind of contribution can I make? Yeah. And I guess, lots of people who come close to death talk about how it makes you rethink things. It makes you think about whether what you're doing is worthwhile. And I suppose I had something like that. And I also really wanted to make sure I didn't just go into an academic ivory tower and do something that was not of use to other people. So I decided I really wanted to write a book that was, as far as possible, accessible to people, that would open up conversations, and that was about an issue that I really cared about. And so I settled on a book about New Zealand politics, because I'd studied a bit of politics and law. I also felt there were some things that were really wrong, deeply wrong with politics in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I thought maybe through a book that could speak to a broad group of people, that could open conversations, we could help to start getting things back on the right track.
It has you sum it up in a beautiful phrase. The book develops a narrative about why New Zealand has lost its way. Why has New Zealand lost its way, Max?
So I think New Zealand's lost its way because we've lost the values that need to drive our politics. And our politics has become quite technical and technocratic. We see that in the language of citizens and clients, as opposed to the language of being citizens in this country. As well, our politics has lost a sense of an end goal or a direction.
So people are saying, what's the point of politics?
Yeah, what's the vision? Where are we going? We get people harking back to romantic pasts. We get talk of being pragmatic and muddling through, but we don't really have a destination.
We also get people like our Pacifica peoples or our millennials going, what's the point of being involved?
Exactly.
I don't see what these old people are doing who are in power.
It doesn't seem to make a difference to people. Yeah, so that's part of why it's lost its way. And then I think as well, at a deeper level, especially since the 1980s, New Zealand has become more selfish and more self-interested. And I think we've had a kind of new common sense develop where it's become okay to think just about what's in it for ourselves as individuals rather than what's best for us as a society or as a community.
That harks back to Thatcher, who said there's no such thing as society, which I think personally is one of the most evil things we can ever say.
Exactly.
It was so blatantly wrong, but it took hold.
Exactly, and it challenged the idea that we had a social fabric that tied us together, that we had strands of connection between us, and stopped us from being able to talk more openly about shared values. So that's how I think we've lost our way, and I think that we need to make values more central again, that values need to be the kind of navigating lights that we use to judge where we're going, and that's a way to stop our politics from being too technical or directionless or too selfish. Yeah.
But let's look at that. For someone who is doing well, I've got my Maserati in the garage and I've got my big house. I'm okay. I'm an island. I mean, I haven't got that, but this is what some people say.
Sure. I'm
okay. So they should be okay if they got their act together. What do you say to that, Max? Because to me it seems the wealthiest is no better than the least in a society, but I don't know how to get that across.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say is even amongst wealthy people in our society, we know there are increasing levels of anxiety and stress and loneliness. So I don't think the wealth, the Maseratis, the big houses are necessarily translating into a sense of happiness and fulfillment in life.
Or connectedness.
Yeah, and I was going to say that next, that even those people that are fulfilled and maybe aren't so stressed or anxious, those people I think feel disconnected or are disconnected from the rest of our society, and I don't think that's a good place for our community to be in. I think we have this increasing social distance between people where we're struggling to empathise or understand our community. And on top of that, we see all of these signs of a broken society around homelessness, rough sleeping, people going to prison in large numbers. And I think even if we're just taking the perspective of those people whose lives seem to be going okay, that's not a society that we can be proud of.
There's a lot of talk about us heading the OECD numbers in suicide. I mean, that is a shameful statistic for a country of 4.5 million.
Absolutely.
Inherently, there's something in the Kiwi spirit, though, I think, that longs for connection. That's was right. Our genesis. That was our nationhood, wasn't it?
That's right. And that's what gives me a bit more hope, is I think in the best of our past and in the best of our character and in the best of our community, we have resources that could make us a more connected society. And I think there's just enough left of warmth, but also the values that I talk about, values like care, community, and creativity, that can take us back to regaining a sense of direction and regaining a sense of where we're going.
Let's look then. Let's step from the negative to the positive.
Sure.
These values are so beautifully articulated in the book.
Thanks.
They're actually based on Māori values, aren't they? So care could be manaakitanga.
Yeah, or they at least have parallels, yes,
They have
in
parallels.
in Te Ao Māori, in the Māori world, yes. So I talk about care, community, and creativity, and a number of Māori who I've spoken to have said, well, these are very similar values to values that have guided Māori communities for centuries. So in the case of care, people talk about manaakitanga, which is in some ways bigger than care. It goes to kind of openness and hospitality.
And deep respect for one another.
Deep respect, yeah, that's
Yes.
right. I talk about community, which is about recognising that we're interdependent, and Māori have said that's similar to whakapapa or to whakawhanaungatanga. And then creativity is a trickier one, in that it probably reflects a kind of series of Māori values, but there's owahatanga, there's actually rangatiratanga. So I think Anne Salmon recently has been talking about experiments across worlds in different moments in New Zealand history, and I'd like to think that a values-based politics is another example of a kind of experiment across the worlds we have in New Zealand, where there's resonance in the idea of values for Māori and for non-Māori in this country.
So let's bring those down to some really concrete examples.
Yeah.
Let's look at how care and
Yeah.
community
Yeah.
and this idea of creativity, which of
Yeah.
course
Yeah.
brings in new business ideas and nurtures business ideas into being that create the economic wealth we want. Let's look at an example of that, where you might see that in action, Max.
Sure. So, I think we can think of lots of examples where we're lacking in care and community at the moment.
All right, let's begin with that.
And we can move to some positive examples too. But I think in high levels of loneliness that people are experiencing, we see a need for community. So there's a 2010 survey, the general social survey that was done, that showed actually young people in New Zealand are lonelier than older people. That 18% of young people in that survey said they felt lonely in the last month, compared to 11% of older people. That's one example where we're kind of lacking in community. We see lots of examples where care is conspicuously lacking. I think in how we talk as a society about people on benefits and people in prison. These are human beings, but they're often talked about as bludgers, as monsters, as people not deserving of respect and care. And those narratives that have kind of built up and become normal, I think they show a real deficit in capacity to care. But on the more positive side, I do think we see little kind of germs of care and community and creativity in how we live our lives every day. So when we stop and check if someone's okay when they're curled up asleep in a park that we're walking through, that's care in action. When we see the fact that, as someone was doing this morning, a young person's helping an older person on a laptop in a cafe as an older person's struggling, I think that's a recognition that we are interdependent, that we need each other. And with creativity, I think in the arts in particular, in what musicians and theatre makers and filmmakers are saying and doing, we see a kind of ebbing pulse of imagination. And a writer called Timothy Morton said that art is thought from the future, and I think that's true. There's a lot in that artists are often expressing these kind of ideas that are just ahead of where the rest of us are. And so what I think is we need to kind of centre these values again, and in all that we're doing in politics, not just in Parliament, but we need to be asking, is what we're doing living up to care, community and creativity, or is what we're doing actually cutting across those cornerstone values that reflect the best in who we are?
And the demoralised society, because I think people, as I said, do care, but there's a sense of demoralisation. I think
right.
Jacinda Ardern is waking something up. There's some sense of hope that there might be a new direction. But we are a bit demoralised as a people at the moment, aren't we?
Yeah, that's right. And that demoralisation comes up in different ways, but I think one of the ways it comes up is in people feeling like they don't have a stake in the society, which comes from a feeling that we don't have a shared community that we're inhabiting. And I think values and principles that we have in common can help us bring us back to that shared community. And we also see that demoralisation in people drifting out and checking out of politics and in voting, because why would you take part in a political system if you don't feel like that is a system that you are part of, that you have a stake in? And that's why you see relatively low voter turnout. It's in part why you see it, and that's why we see low voter turnout in other groups, including people with low incomes, Māori, Pacifica, recent migrants. There are lots of reasons for why people are disengaged, but I think we need to kind of flip the problem from saying these people are to blame for not engaging to saying it's the system that's to blame for not doing enough to bring people in and to kind of remoralise us and give us a shared sense of values.
And typically the neo-lib response to that is, oh, don't blame the system, it's individuals. But in fact, a really good example, Max, is a young Tongan friend of mine who did a post the other night about how her mother works 3 jobs. There are 6 kids and she manages all of that, works day and night. She still has debt. She's on very low wages. And she said, I just don't know how we can get out of this. We are working our hardest. We don't take from society. She had a massive response from her community. Many of them saying, I don't even want to vote because I don't trust what's being promised.
Yeah.
Too many promises are broken.
Yeah.
So how we engage this wonderful population, really it does come down to values and honouring values.
That's right. And I think, if we look at especially the last 20 to 30 years, we see a history of broken promises in politics and also mistakes that have never been corrected. So for the Pacific community, I'm not best placed to speak to this, but there were the Dawn raids in the 1980s, for which an apology has never been given. For the Māori community, there was the Foreshore and Seabed Act in 2004, which removed fundamental rights for Māori. So turning the tide on how people feel about politics isn't always going to be easy, and it's not always going to be something that can be achieved overnight. Like in those cases, it's got to be a gradual regaining of trust, but we can start to do that by having a more inclusive conversation. And there are other things that we can do in the short term. But coming to that post in particular, I think what that gets at is coming out of this rising selfishness and self-interestedness since the 80s, and combining that with this kind of punishing, punitive streak in our culture. There has been this narrative that people who don't have a lot of money have made bad choices. You hear that on Talkback Radio, you hear that in the comments and articles online, and it just doesn't square with my experience of people who are struggling. And my experience of those people is that they do extremely well to juggle a number of things and to support families, to support other friends who are going through difficult times, to work, and in those situations it's very hard to make flawless choices. It's very hard, and I think we need as a society to try and build back that empathy and go beyond empathy, and that's why I talk about love in the book, because love is something more active.
Which I was going to come to. It's sort of your fourth value, and it's a very brave value, because typically that's been dismissed as a bit soft or a bit anti-intellectual. It's not really substantive, yet it is the very essence of human existence, isn't it, Max? Tell me the place of aroha, of love.
Yeah, well, when I think of love, I think of being really lucky to have a wonderful mum who just was kind of a constant well of warmth and patience and kindness in my life. And I also think of a number of Māori and Pacifica friends who've talked to me about the importance of aroha or alofa in their communities. And I think we all have a picture of what love is, and it's meaningful to most people, either because of how it's been present in our lives or because of its absence. And I think it's a meaningful value that we might introduce into politics, in part to make politics meaningful and important again.
When I read that in the book, I felt more excited about that than anything, because that truly is innovative. It is something that a typical baby boomer would shy away from, going more into the intellect, less into the heart. It's as if you're saying we have to drop down into our heart space to lead this country, don't we?
That's right. And
that's a brave person who would do that.
Well, yeah, I'm not, I think, the first person to talk about it, and some others like Bell Hooks have spoken about a love ethic, but I do think we need to talk openly about emotion and feeling and heart. And actually, a lot of politics is about emotion. It's what justice is about in part. It's what freedom is about in part. And so I think we need to be open to it. And I actually think it's not soft to talk about love. I think in a society where we are encouraged just to think about what's best for the individual, where we see success as being about individual wealth. It's actually quite hard to make the case for love, to say that love needs to be central again. And on top of that, not being soft, I still think we might need a bit more tenderness, a bit more softness in how we talk about, especially people doing it rough in our society.
Having said that, it's quite a muscular form of love. It's quite an active form of love that you advocate. Who are some of the people that you've spoken to get your inspirations for these values, particularly that one, Max?
Yeah. So one person who has had a real influence on me in my thinking about values is Moana Jackson, and he is a constitutional lawyer and thinker who's generally stood outside of universities and has written really imaginatively about how Māori ways of thinking could change our political system for the better. And he has spoken about the importance of values, and he has said that if you want to see the politics of love in action, you can see it on many marae around the country. And
give me an example of that.
I again, as someone who's Pākehā, is probably not the best person to give an example of that, but I have spent time on marae, and what I would say is, to me, love is about a deep sense of warmth towards another, and I think the way it's expressed is through being selfless. And one specific thing that I think is closely tied to love is listening and being a good listener. And I think you see that on a marae, just to get concrete, where you see long discussions, and you see real respect being shown to the views of people that get up and speak. So that's one example, but there are other people that have really influenced my thinking on values as well. Sian Elias, the Chief Justice.
For whom you worked as a young law clerk?
Yeah, for 18 months. She has been a lawyer her whole life and now a judge, but she has always talked about finding more, these are my words, not hers, but paraphrasing, finding a kind of spine in our law in the language of values and principles, and finding what's common, and that stretch to find a kind of ethical base for everything that we do has really influenced me. So yeah, she'd be someone else. And someone else is Kim Workman, who is a guy who has spent time in the police. He spent time in prisons, in leadership positions in the public sector. And he started a group called Rethinking Crime and Punishment, which did what the name suggests. It was pushing for a different debate on prisons. And I think in the work that he did, he expressed love towards, in particular, people in prison. And he wanted a better way for people, and still wants in the work he does, a better way for people who find themselves in prison. So yeah, there are all these people that have kind of fed into my thinking about values, and I think that's partly the strength of a values framework, is that it connects to the heart as well as the head, and it connects to a lot of us, not just hopefully to kind of academics or intellectuals or just a smaller portion of our community.
And of course you quote from all these people in the book. If you're just joining us, this is Max Harris talking about the New Zealand project, and there is such richness in it, in all these little references. You give much greater detail in the book. I love the idea of that, as I said, muscular love that is on the marae.
Yeah,
there is a real respect, a real listening to people.
Yeah.
That it has been lacking in the national debate very much, hasn't it? With all that glibness that, as you said, we hear on Talkback Radio, the black and white, the good and bad. The I'll respect this one and I'll dismiss that one, which we saw in Materia Ture's case recently, didn't we?
That's right. And
the subtlety gets lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lack of listening, good listening in Parliament, where you see people kind of throwing insults at each other and not listening to questions, let alone answers. But yeah, I think you see a lack of love too in how a lot of political discussion happens. Not all talkback radios like this, but I think there is this strand of viciousness, of harshness, and an unwillingness to empathise with people in positions different from our own. And that's not in all cases people's fault. I think our political system has encouraged that way of thinking. And yet, I think in the response to Materia Ture's sharing of her experiences on a benefit, and we saw some of the worst of this punitiveness come to light. And I think the fact that Materia Ture has then had to step back is a real shame, because our politics should be a space where different perspectives can be heard and reflected, and the perspectives of beneficiaries, people on a benefit, haven't really been heard loudly in my lifetime, I think, since the 80s. There are some people who've worked hard, like Darian Fenton or Sue Bradford, to push for the rights of beneficiaries, but this was the first time a conversation was really started, and a conversation that was vulnerable and that was honest. And I know people on a benefit who said, this made them sit up and take notice about politics for the first time. And the way that's been shut down just reminds us how far we have to go in widening our window of who's heard in our politics and what can be discussed.
And of course, when the beneficiaries who wanted to speak up then see the person who's spoken on their behalf shut down, they pull back and maybe don't participate. And that's another betrayal of this voice that needs to be heard in the election. That's
a risk. But what's been positive, actually, I think, in the last few weeks is there have been a number of people coming out and saying we need to continue the conversation that Materia Ture started. And so, there are websites like one called We Are Beneficiaries, which has been set up to share the stories of people on benefit, to say to the rest of New Zealand, this is the reality of a life that you might not be familiar with. And I think that the challenge for all of us in that specific space is to try to honour what Materia Ture started, and to try to slowly shift that culture so we pull away that strand of punitiveness and move towards a strand of care or community or love.
And you raised something very interesting there with that site, because we are unfortunately in little silos of discussion. So we have these echo chambers with people whose views are our own in a way. Where do you think the media can embody these values? Perhaps we need some kind of true public broadcaster who can allow all the perspectives, because that again has been subject to a form of censorship, I feel. What do you think, Max?
Yeah, well, just to say something on the silos first, I think I completely agree about the kind of silos we're in. One thing I think that's important to recognise is that's also political, and that as we've become more unequal as a society, we've grown apart, and so it's been harder to talk about and talk with people with different life experiences. And I think the media, just to get to your question, I think has a real role to play in trying to bridge those divides and to improve the quality of conversations we're having as a country.
Which they're not going to do while they're driven by money. So does one politician need to step up and say, we will have one centralised broadcaster? When you were a little boy, there was still this sense of centralised television, and we would go to work and discuss ideas. Now we're all so apart in our communication devices.
Yeah, I agree. So I think there does need to be a push for more public broadcasting in New Zealand, and that public broadcasting, as Nicky Hager told me when I spoke to him, could give us a sense of shared principles. Now, I think we still need diverse media sources to kind of complicate the conversation, to give us challenging perspectives, but I think there's a lot that public broadcasting can do, and what a public broadcaster can do as well is to try to seek out, as broadcasters, people with a range of life experiences. It can commit to that. It can take some risks because it might not be so beholden to the profit motive. And I think that's another thing that can happen in the media is, unfortunately, I think our media can be punitive and harsh because some of the journalists who do their best but may not have had the life experiences that allow them to empathise. And so I think you see someone like Mihi Forbes and the work that she's done, say, recently in Manurewa, talking about benefits, producing very different material from other journalists. And so, I would like to see broadcasters with more life experience. Public broadcasting can help to take that risk. And the other thing that the media can do, and there's lots of things I can talk about, but just to say one more thing is they can uphold values in a different way. They can try to show that behind seemingly neutral political statements, there are values and agendas there too. And I think that's the role for the media in a values-based politics, is a kind of more critical role, is to say there are always values everywhere, even when they're being denied, even when someone is saying they're just being practical or pragmatic. And I think the media has played that role in the past, but we need to commit to that again. I
would love to see more for millennials like you, whose voice is more heard as well within that.
That's
but right. You finish, you say it's a very personal book. You are in the narrative very much as a Kiwi. And you say in that initial opening chapter, everybody can have their New Zealand project. This is your one. And it does encompass many different aspects of our lives. But you can have an artwork that's a New Zealand project, can't you? You'd love to see all Kiwis thinking like this.
And I think that might be unusual for some people to hear the kind of writer in the narrative, but the part of my reason for doing that is I don't want to present myself as a kind of objective observer standing above things.
A godlike figure.
Exactly.
No, it's a very humble perspective.
I hope so, and I want to say that it's a personal perspective, but yeah, everyone is going to have a different vision for the future of New Zealand, a different New Zealand project. What everyone might not have at the moment is a sense of empowerment that allows them to give voice to that vision, and that's where I think we still have some way to go. I think there are a lot of people that feel like politics is not a space that is ready to hear their voice, or not a space that's welcome to them, and that means they can't comfortably express their vision or their New Zealand project. And so that's what I think we have to work on, is to provide information that people need, but provide confidence and power, importantly, especially to groups that have been neglected and marginalised and denigrated historically, and that way will allow as many New Zealand projects to be expressed, and we'll have hopefully a better politics.
Max Harris, we're going to talk more in future programmes just about some of these visions in this wonderful book, The New Zealand Project, but thank you so much. Empowerment is what it gave me, a sense of empowerment for the future.
Thanks.